without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, September 27th, for our Inside Track webinar, where we look at all of our latest and greatest public opinion research about America and the upcoming midterm elections. So the agenda is actually very simple today, though we, as always, have a lot of data to share with you. We're going to go through sort of what the main issues Americans think facing the country. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a couple of those issues and share some new data we have on them to just sort of highlight some of the different facets of America. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the elections, which are just over a month and a half away, just under rather a month and a half away. Which I think is, what sort of everybody is starting to look forward to. And then, as Ellen said, I will certainly have some time available if anyone has any questions. You can actually submit the questions at any time using the Q&A function of the GoToMeeting application. So if you do hear anything that you're curious about, you can go ahead, log that question in, and I will answer as many as possible once we get to the end. All right, so main issue. This is from our 538 tracking poll. We've been going to about 2,000 Americans every month on our knowledge panel, asking them what their top 3 concerns or worries are. And we've seen this number actually pretty stable across the summer. Inflation is the issue Americans are most concerned with, 55% listing it as one of their top issues this year, fundamentally unchanged from where it was in August. After that, political extremism, polarization, crime, and gun violence are sort of the next tier of issues. Just under a third of Americans focused on that. Again, pretty much unchanged. Climate change, healthcare, immigration, racism, taxes, etc., sort of fall further down the list. And I think the thing that is worth noting from this is how stable the issue landscape is in America right now. Despite sort of all the news, all the sort of the churn that we see in cable news or on Twitter or what have you, the actual issue landscape has been remarkably stable. Americans are concerned about costs, they're concerned about how much they're having to pay for stuff, and then after that, they're concerned about their personal safety, and they're concerned about the sort of very caustic political environment that we find ourselves within. Indeed, the only thing that really seems to be changing significantly is COVID or coronavirus, which continues to slide down the list of concerns for Americans, currently down 6 percentage points to 8% of Americans listing it as their top concern this month. Everything else is basically at the same place it was in August. But there's lots of different ways you can ask this question, lots of different ways you can kind of look at it. So this is a different version of that kind of shows this same thing. This is from our Ipsos Reuters polling from 2 separate Ipsos Reuters polls. And one is a question where we just say, what should President Joe Biden prioritize? What should his focus be? And you can see, again, it's the economy, which is basically the same as the last one, talking about inflation, employment and jobs, unifying the country, immigration, environment, corruption, taxation, further down the list. Crime doesn't show up on this one because crime isn't really a national federal issue so much as it's a state and local issue. But you can see the issue priority, very similar to what we saw when we asked Americans what they were worried about. So what Americans want the president to focus on, what they're worried about, very closely linked. And then we asked a similar question, what issue will influence your choice of candidate in the upcoming elections? And again, we saw very similar information coming out of the data. By far, it is inflation, rising prices, the economy as the top factors feeding into people's choices. And then a range of other issues like abortion, like crime, like healthcare, extremism, immigration, etc. But you can see this is really an election after you sort of filter out all the noise, all the social media furor, all the churn out there, that is about the economy fundamentally. So let's look at that a little bit more, how Americans feel about the economy. This is our consumer confidence tracking we field every 2 weeks with Forbes. It has, we've been actually fielding it every month since 2002. And then we've been fielding it every 2 weeks since the pandemic began. The pandemic little signifier and the Great Recession signifier are actually slightly the wrong places, so I need to move those. But what they show is that American consumer confidence, which is essentially just our measure of how Americans feel about the economy and about their personal economic condition, is been relatively stable over the last couple of weeks, last couple of months of the summer, currently at 50%. It's been kind of at the same place for the last few weeks. And while that stability is good and that it's not still going down, if you look at sort of the entire historical time series of American consumer sentiment, it's at a relatively low place, a lower than average place. Average is actually closer to 55%, and certainly lower than it was before the pandemic, and lower even than where it was last year, last summer, when we sort of had that brief period where everyone thought the vaccines were going to end the pandemic, and before inflation really started to kick into gear. So consumer confidence has stabilized. It's stabilized at a moderate level, but not a good level, not actually necessarily a very bad level either, because again, you can look at the Great Recession, consumer confidence was much weaker back then. So it's just, Americans are feeling okay or sort of meh about the economy right now, very sort of middling. And I think that's sort of filtering into their views of a lot of different things, including the elections that we're going to talk about in a minute. And as we sort of dig into the data, we see this sort of middling attitude about consumer confidence happening because of sort of two factors. Traditionally, consumer sentiment is very strongly linked to employment. If you have a job, you can feel better about your about your economic security. If you don't have a job, of course, you feel much worse. And what we've seen is that Americans' job security has remained relatively decent. It's not certainly as good as it was, again, last summer when there was that sort of brief bout of exuberance, but it's stayed somewhere around 40% of Americans saying that they're confident or comfortable with their job security, which is about where sort of the historical average is, maybe even a touch higher. But at the same time, we've seen the number of Americans saying that they feel comfortable with their ability to make household purchases, essentially afford the goods that they need for their daily life, has continued to weaken. And this is really, I think, an indicator of the power or the bite that inflation has had on Americans right now. So what we see essentially is a delinkage of job security, which has remained relatively good. And indeed, if you look at sort of federal data, unemployment is still very low, hiring is still relatively robust. So the job market has remained relatively good and relatively strong, even as price pressures have continued to hurt people and really press down on people's disposable income. And that's why we're in this sort of middling period, right? We have people's economic expectations or confidence is being backstopped by their job security, even though they're still feeling a lot of that personal pressure, right? They're feeling that income, that pressure on their income based on inflation, driving that down. So that's the environment we're in right now. That's the economic environment we're in. That's why we have so many people talking about inflation and prices as their number one issue. That's why we have so many people saying that that should be the priority for President Biden or for Congress, is because of that sort of inflation or price pressure, even though we're not actually seeing the economy in nearly as bad a place as we saw, for instance, in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And then sort of digging in to that household purchase number a little bit more, we do see actually that everyone's kind of feeling not great about their ability to make household purchases. Up and down sort of the income ladder, you see sort of high income, more affluent households in the dark blue, middle income in the teal, and then low income in the yellow. And you can see everyone's kind of sort of ended up in the same place recently, where everyone doesn't feel great about their ability to make sort of the regular daily household purchases. You can see that these groups really separated sort of in the last 2 years during sort of the first part of the recovery, but inflation has sort of pushed everybody back together in this sort of almost unified sense of everything sort of sucking a little bit. So, you know, it's a moment of shared pain, I think, in the United States that we're seeing, which again, I think is feeding into this broader desire for some sort of action on the economy. changing gears slightly to COVID. Now, I mentioned COVID has declined as the main issue, has really been sort of dropping as a main issue for a while. Indeed, we've actually ended the scheduled publication of our Axios Ipsos coronavirus tracking poll, which we've been running since the start of the pandemic. We released our last issue of that earlier this month. But I just wanted to sort of show you, just in brief, what 2.5 years of American behavior change actually kind of looks like. Because the pandemic, even though we're sort of trying to get past it, we're trying not to think about it as much as possible, does still live with us. It still happens. You're still seeing about 3 times as many people dying each day of COVID as die from car accidents, for instance. So it's still, a major impact in people's lives, but it's also the largest behavior change in modern American history. It's the largest change of Americans' behavior since probably World War II. And this is a chart that basically shows the patterns of that. So you can see the number of Americans who said that they had gone out to eat or visited friends or relatives in the purple and teal, dropped precipitously right after the start of the pandemic, and then sort of slowly climb back up over time with ebbs and flows basically tied to pandemic waves. So you can see it sort of increased, and then there was the winter wave of 2020, which is that next dip, and then it sort of continued to climb as the vaccination effort came out, and then that dropped down a little bit again as the Delta and then Omicron waves of COVID came out, until we've sort of gotten back to this place where the public's kind of stopped caring so much and have basically resumed sort of pre-pandemic levels of socialization in a typical week. And at the same time, you can see these mitigating or protective behaviors changing over time. So wearing a mask, which was sort of the dominant one, rising up, through the first year. But then as the vaccination campaign got underway, you saw mask use drop and never really recover. It sort of went up or down a little bit, certainly came up a little bit during the Omicron wave this last winter, but has slid, and fewer Americans continuing to wear a mask at all times. So this is the last 2.5 years of how America has responded to the pandemic. And I think, we are looking at a place now where, moving forward, people's behaviors have sort of been baked in. So there is a chunk of the population, 10% maybe, that's probably going to be wearing a mask when they're out in public forever at this point. There's probably a third of the population who's going to stay concerned about COVID for probably ever at this point. But likewise, there's also a third or so of the population that just doesn't think it's a big deal, doesn't care, doesn't even think about it on a regular basis. And then a third that's sort of in between, is a little worried about it, but isn't doing a lot to change their behavior. And this is essentially our reality now of how sort of the country is navigating the path forward. This is actually looking at levels of concern. So this is actually what I was talking about how Americans increasingly aren't as worried about it. And the dark red is the level of very or extremely concern from the beginning, March 2020, to when we released this most recent poll earlier this month, 24%. And you can just see that most Americans say they're somewhat or not very concerned. There's some level of concern. Still very few say they're not at all concerned, right? That's that group that just doesn't care. But this, I think, illustrates how, we are in a country now that is very divided on sort of their views and the legacy of the pandemic. I'm going to skip over this one for now. Changing issue topics again to immigration. Immigration is a second order issue. It is down that issue hierarchy. It's 10% or so of American listing it as one of their main issues, but it's very powerful, very impactful, particularly in Republican sort of politicking, Republican policymaking, Republican sort of media. So we recently did a survey where we asked people sort of their beliefs about several myths about sort of immigration, particularly immigration across the southern border. And we also, not just myths, but sort of characterization. So one of them is the United States experiencing an invasion at the southern border, right? So it's this very strong, loaded terminology. And you can see a little over half of Americans think that that's a true statement, including a large majority, 76% of Republicans. So that I think feeds into sort of this idea that immigration is a problem, even if it's not necessarily a top tier problem, it is a problem, right? Because people do buy this sort of idea that there is this kind of invasion. Second, this is more of a myth that migrants bringing fentanyl and other illegal drugs over the southern border are responsible for the increase in drug overdoses and deaths in the United States. There is certainly some fentanyl and legal drugs. It's not really migrants bringing most of it, it's smugglers bringing most of it. But anyways, you do again see that half of Americans, 50%, think this is somewhat or completely true. And then finally, the US is implementing an open border policy along the southern border. 42% of Americans think that's somewhat or completely true. It's not, including a majority, 63% of Republicans. So these are sort of these ideas about what's happening in immigration, particularly immigration across the southern border, that have sort of permeated into society that aren't necessarily true, aren't necessarily accurate, or may just be exaggerations, but they feel sort of truthy, to borrow from Stephen Colbert's sort of lingo. And that sort of feeds a lot of the debate about immigration, which isn't really based on facts so much as feelings. And speaking of sort of feelings, we also did a survey recently for Reuters asking about the stunts that the governors of Florida and Texas have done recently, where they've been shipping newly arrived immigrants, undocumented immigrants, to Democratic cities. So Texas Governor Greg Abbott has been busing people to Chicago and New York and DC. And then Florida Governor DeSantis actually rounded up a bunch of migrants in Texas and flew them to Martha's Vineyard. And the majority of Americans had heard at least something about those stories. So they had succeeded in getting that sort of attention. But at the same time, a majority of Americans thought that wasn't necessarily the best use of resources, that only about 29% of Americans support that states should bus migrants to states or other states or Washington D.C. Even fewer think that federal tax dollars should be paying for that. Again, relatively strong partisan differences by it. But you can sort of see that these stunts, while attention grabbing, were in a lot of ways sort of playing to the base and not necessarily something that the broad majority of Americans feel is an appropriate policy, even while they sort of believe a lot of these sort of myths about it. And indeed, there was one additional data point from the survey that's not on the slide, that about half of Americans believed that Joe Biden should be doing more about immigration. So again, even though this specific set of actions was not good, someone should be doing more. And about half of Americans said that Democrats in Democratic cities were being somewhat hypocritical about complaining about busing of migrants to their jurisdiction. So you can see a little bit of a pox on both their house's attitude among the American public on immigration, where people feel that someone should be doing more. This is probably not what should be done, but everyone's sort of not doing a good job with the topic. All right, now I'm going to turn to the election. Some of this is going to be stuff that I might have shared with you before, but I think it's always important to sort of have a reset of some of the ground truths around the election. So first off, and again, I've shared this with you before, you probably should remember this. In a midterm election like this year, only about a third of the population typically takes part. So we are not talking about mass turnout, all Americans showing up to vote. It's a relative minority of the population. Indeed, 2018, which was the last midterm election, was uncharacteristically high turnout in that election, with 44% of US adults taking part. But more typically, it's about 18, 19%, not 18, 19, 35, 36% rather, of the public that takes part. Midterms do also tend to swing relatively consistently, so it's not like one party always wins in the midterms, and that's unlike the presidential election. In the presidential election, you can see most of the time Democrats get more votes than Republicans, or at least it's a pretty close tie. The only time that the Republican actually got more votes outright was the 2004 presidential election since the turn of the millennium. But in midterms, it goes back and forth a lot more because, again, you're talking about a smaller chunk of the population. And after the 2020 election with Biden and Trump, which had really high turnout, it was about 60% of the country that took part in the election. We're probably going to see a lot fewer voters in terms of total numbers. So, the election could go either way, and you're still not actually seeing the same level of turnout that we saw in 2020. Now, I do think that we're probably going to see a higher level of turnout than that sort of 35% we've seen historically, and I'll get into that in a minute. I think it might be closer to sort of 2018 turnout levels where it's 40, maybe, 42, 43% of the population taking part. But that doesn't necessarily say anything about who's going to win or who's not. Because remember, 28% of the country voted for Trump, 30% of the country voted for Biden, 42% didn't take part. And this is, again, of all adults. So this actually does include people who are not actually eligible voters, which is why the eligible voter number would be a little bit higher than this. But anyways, just to, again, sort of have a ground setting of what is happening in the midterm. This is an election that's going to be decided by a minority of Americans. Now, again, sort of looking at historical data, this is all of the midterm elections plotted against the president's approval rating in the month before that election from World War II to now. The blue bar is about where President Biden's approval rating is right now, around 40%, a little higher, a little lower, depending on the day. But you can see, I think, two things. In the House of Representatives, which is on the left, there has not been a case of a president with this level approval rating, his party picking up or gaining seats in the midterm. It has not happened in American history since World War II. The only instances where we have seen an incumbent president's party gain seats in the midterm, the president was very popular. And you can sort of see that those two dots sort of to the far right of that. But the Senate, on the other hand, the Senate is a little bit more of a wild card. There's a much larger range of potential options, including two instances where the party in power actually gained seats with an incumbent president around 40%. So, I think this, again, sort of feeds how we're going to be talking about the election in a little bit. But the House of Representatives, historically speaking, likely to go more Republican. The Senate, probably more likely than not to go Republican, all things equal. But again, is a little bit more of that wild card, a little bit more of that likelihood that the Democrats may hold or even pick up a seat or two. Now, speaking of presidential approval, this is our Reuters Ipsos tracking for Joe Biden and his approval rating. We have him currently at 39%. I think that's just below sort of what his average is in public polling, and it's extremely polarized. So 3/4 of Democrats approving versus 13% of Republicans. And his approval with independents is relatively low, 28% as well. This is similar to where Trump was about this time in his presidency, though Trump had a stronger number with Republicans than Biden does with Democrats. Biden is having a harder time holding on to Democratic support than Trump did Republican support. And indeed, we see that when we ask questions, and this is from a USA Today poll we released in August, about who each party wants to see as their standard bearer. And we still see a majority of Republicans saying that they like Trump, they think Trump should be the nominee in 2024, but only a minority, 44% of Democrats saying the same about Joe Biden. Instead, the majority, 56% of Democrats say that it's time for a change and Biden should not run. So this is sort of a picture of where each party is right now. They're divided. It's certainly not overwhelming. It's not like 80% of Republicans want Trump to win or 80% of Democrats don't want Biden to run. But it is, you do see Republicans a little bit more coalesced than Democrats are around sort of the Trumpy direction of the party. And when we ask people sort of why they think Democrats have not been doing well, why Biden hasn't done well, sort of trying to get into this, why do Democrats particularly want to sort of see a turning of the page? We see it's because most Americans do not think Democrats have been able to accomplish their objectives in 2021 and 2022. This is the one at the bottom. Only 23% of Americans, including only 32% of Democrats, believe that Democrats have accomplished their objectives. Instead, the large majority of Americans don't think that Democrats have sort of done what they set out to do. I think you could sort of argue about how much Democrats have actually failed to enact their agenda, considering some of the legislation they've been able to push through, some of the things they've been able to do. But this is the perception, right, of what's going on in the Democratic Party. And you do see huge differences between Republicans and Democrats, and why. Republicans think it's because Democrats have been unwilling to do what's needed or unable to stop fighting each other. Democrats instead are more likely to blame Republicans for not being able to accomplish their agenda. It's sort of typical finger pointing kind of stuff, but I think really the most important thing is that 3/4 of Americans don't think that Democrats have actually accomplished what they set out to do. And if we link that all the way back to where we started, that Americans are worried about inflation, they're worried about the economy, this is why Democrats and why President Biden specifically are in a little bit of the hot seat, because Americans don't necessarily think they are delivering. And indeed, when we ask people specifically what are their sort of primary aspects, what they're going to vote for, it is the economy and inflation. That is what most Americans say are their top tier issues. A little bit stronger for Republicans than Democrats. Democrats have a much sort of wider range of things they're concerned about. 14%, for instance, about abortion, 8% about climate change. But the economy is sort of that main issue, and that's a problem for Democrats because Republicans continue to be seen as stronger on economic issues. This is from our Reuters Ipsos tracking poll, and you can see on the economy, Republicans, when we ask people which party is better on various issues, on the economy, Republicans have a 10-point advantage. On jobs, Republicans have a 3-point advantage. And on inflation, which is, again, sort of the top issue, Republicans have a 10-point advantage. Those are all very bad signs for Democrats going into the midterms, because typically the party that is seen as stronger on the issue most people care about tends to win. Now, on other issues, Democrats are better positioned, right? So everything from healthcare to women's rights to the environment, we see Democrats actually are seen as sort of having the better plans, the better policies. And this is sort of the landscape, right? As long as it's an economic focused agenda, Democrats are in trouble, right? If the agenda sort of changes to anything else, Democrats are actually in better shape. And indeed, you see the Democrats sort of trying to talk about other stuff. And this is part of the problem Republicans have had this year is Republicans have struggled to keep the agenda focused on the economy, and they're sort of doing everything to sort of draw attention to anything else, even though that's actually probably not the best thing for their chances. So you have, DeSantis's Martha's Vineyard flights, you have Trump's ongoing sort of legal issues, you have various candidates across the country saying all sorts of crazy things, abortion and the Dobbs ruling sort of pulling focus. So the very fractured focus, the fact that most people, the media cycle at least, is not really focusing on the economy on a regular basis, is helpful to the Democrats. And it's actually one of the reasons I think Democrats are doing as well as they are in polling, that if we sort of reverted back to sort of the baseline, Republicans would be in a better position. So when we ask people specifically, so again, we've asked lots of different versions of this question. This is, are you more or less likely to support someone who supports various public policies? The policies that are more likely to engender sort of broad support are fighting crime, continuing support of the Ukraine. Policies that are very likely to cause you to lose support are sort of book bans, all that sort of anti-CRT crap that's been going on in schools, and abortion, restricting abortion. These are sort of the areas at the either end of the spectrum. Trump himself is not actually, it's hugely polarized, but in terms of the total number, supporting or not getting support or not support from Trump doesn't actually have a huge impact. So even though Trump is kind of the focus, it doesn't drive people's vote quite as much. And then with the election that's coming up, this is a little bit of an aside. I think it is important just to keep in mind that some of the damages we've seen in trust in the institutions of elections continue to exist. This is from a survey we did with Reuters in September, and we still see that large majorities of Republicans think that voter fraud is a widespread problem and that the election is going to be rigged. And they're somewhat less likely, only 62%, to say that they trust election officials in their community or county to do their job honestly. So, we are still seeing the legacy of the 2020 sort of effort to sort of overturn the election, with Republicans widely distrusting the process, and with a lot of election denier Republican candidates on the ballot this fall. I think it still remains to be seen if some of them lose, what's going to happen. If they refuse to concede the election, or they refuse to leave office, or even sort of more questiony, if some of these election deniers win, what happens in 2024? I don't think anyone has a clear idea about what that has in store. All right, so now just going into election data, this is again from our 538 Ipsos polling, where we've been tracking the same individuals over time. And we can see that Republicans are still a little bit more likely than Democrats to say they are certain to vote in the election. They're still sort of maintaining a little bit of an enthusiasm advantage. We have seen enthusiasm on both sides sort of ramping up a little bit, but Republicans sort of a little bit stronger. Now, remember, Democrats are more numerous. There are more Democrats in America, so Republicans need an enthusiasm advantage, a turnout advantage to sort of beat the more numerous Democrats, but that still seems to be happening to an extent. In our horse race, again on 538, this is national generic congressional ballot. We're essentially seeing a tie, that the generic congressional ballot, you can see for likely voters on the right, is tied 41-41. That basically is probably an advantage to the Republicans, all things equal. Republicans would likely pick up seats in that scenario. But remember, this is a generic congressional ballot. It is an abstract concept. We're just asking people, would you vote Democrat or Republican? Individual races will vary widely, but this is a good indicator to sort of track over time. And you can indeed see over time, it sort of ebbed and flowed a little bit over the summer. July, we saw Democratic enthusiasm bounce up. That was after the Dobbs hearing was released. In August, you saw Republicans sort of come back a little bit. This actually came out just after Trump's Mar-a-Lago home was raided by the FBI, and now we're sort of settling back down into this sort of tie. Digging into the data, and this is external data. This is looking at sort of what all the experts are predicting, about the House of Representatives. We are seeing that the Republicans are expected to do well. The average is that they're expected to end up with 214 seats. You need 218 to get a majority, so they only have to pick up 4 of those toss-up seats. Democrats are expected to have 197 plus some number of the toss-up seats. So, according to sort of the experts and sort of the forecasters, Republicans have the inside track on winning the House of Representatives. And this is sort of based on, there's not a lot of polling that goes into this. Instead, this is based much more on past elections, how various areas voting patterns, things like that, strength of candidates, all these sort of things, and a little bit of polling mixed in, but not heavily poll based. Instead, if we turn to the Senate, which is a little bit more, the evaluation is more poll based, we are still seeing a very sort of expanded map of competitive Senate races, with a lot of seats potentially up for grabs. This is the averages as of this morning from 538 and Real Clear Politics. 538 essentially reports every poll that is released, but they have a adjustment factor. So if they think a poll leans Republican or leans Democrat, they sort of adjust it. And their average, Real Clear Politics, only reports a handful of polls that meet their somewhat obscure criteria to be reported, but then they don't do any adjustment. So it's just sort of a straight mathematical average. It's good to sort of look at both and kind of get a sense of where things are going. But you can see that some places that were thought of as maybe toss-ups earlier are looking a little bit more Democratic friendly, like Arizona, like New Hampshire, like Pennsylvania. Some states that look like they might have been competitive are looking a little bit more Republican. So like Florida or Ohio, where Trump won both states in 2020. They thought briefly that maybe the Democrats would have a good chance, but that's looking a little bit more Republican friendly. And then states that are still very much a toss up. So Georgia, Nevada, um, Wisconsin, North Carolina actually is still kind of close, though I'm expecting that to kind of move more Republican. It's not been heavily polled yet. So those are sort of the states that are looking to be particularly competitive, but all of them are close enough that bear watching. I think Georgia is probably going to be the one that ends up being the closest again, certainly the closest in 2020, 2021 with the runoff. So that's the one that I think bears closely watching. And Democrats need to do well in these races to be able to hold on to control of the Senate. Republicans can afford to win fewer of these and take control of the chamber. So this is sort of the outlook that we're looking at for the Senate. And then turning to the governor's races, which we haven't talked about really much yet. It's a bit of a mix, but incumbency appears to be very powerful this year. Incumbent governors, who are the majority in the majority of races, appear to be doing pretty well. So in Florida, Ron DeSantis looks like he's got a pretty good position to win re-election as governor against former Governor Charlie Crist. Brian Kemp in Georgia looks like he's in a good position to beat Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia House Minority Leader, who's running against him. But then in Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, or not Pennsylvania, but Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, you see incumbent governors doing pretty well. Pennsylvania is actually an open seat. The governor's retiring, but the Democrats actually doing pretty well there. And then Texas, also a state where the incumbent Republican is looking pretty strong against Beto O'Rourke, former member of House, former presidential candidate. And then Nevada, Wisconsin, Arizona, very close elections that probably are going to need to watch down to the wire. And then Kansas is actually a little bit of an interesting one too, where a Democrat won Kansas in 2018. Kansas is normally a pretty Republican-leaning state, but Laura Kelly remains relatively popular, has a slight lead in the polling, and this one still looks like a toss-up. So this is, I think, a big question. How it's going to play out. But these governor's races are important because with the Dobbs decision and sort of the national right to abortion going away from that, abortion is now being set at the state level, and governors have a huge part to play in that. So who wins and who doesn't win, I think, in each of these states has a huge impact in sort of how its abortion laws will end up playing out. So where are we? So Ipsos is still in sort of a place where we're expecting Republicans to make gains this year. We're still in this middle category of narrow Republican wins. They'll take the House by a small margin. The Senate could go either way. Honestly, I could make a convincing argument that the Senate would go one seat Republican, stay 50-50, or go one seat Democratic. I think there are reasonable scenarios to see each one of those happening. There is still, I think, an odds of a red wave, so much larger Republican gains this year. And remember, we do still have about a month and a half before the election, so there is still time for events to happen. And I don't see huge odds for Democrats to hold on to the House or to make significant gains in offices. I think honestly, breaking even is a win for the Democrats, considering the national economic climate, considering how bad the economy is and how bad Democrats are seen on the economy. Narrow Republican wins are actually overperformance for the Democratic Party, considering where they probably should be, considering the conditions. All right, so that's what I got today. Any questions, please? So again, you can use that Q&A field in the GoToMeeting application to punch your questions in, and I am happy to answer as many of them as possible. Also, the next webinar is October 25th, so if you want to have that in your schedule, we'll of course send out a notification of that. All right, so let's see. I've been seeing a lot of reports of Democratic enthusiasm or Democratic gains in the polls. Do you think that's for real? Doesn't seem to match what you're seeing here. I think the Democrats are overperforming in the polls right now, certainly compared to where they should be given broader economic conditions. And I think there's a number of factors to that. I think the fact that the media hasn't really focused on the economy a lot recently, it's kind of focused on everything else, helps. I think the people feel the economy in a way that they don't feel a lot of these other issues, right? You know how much gas costs because you're filling up your car every week or every couple of days. But gas prices have come down a little bit, so again, that's taken some of that pressure off. But I think Republicans have also sort of gotten in their own way a little bit. Trump is still constantly the center of attention, the center of the universe, the media universe. He generates clicks. You understand why. But the Republicans have nominated a lot of candidates who are probably a little suboptimal for the general election. I think if you were just generic Republican, kind of a Mitt Romney character, you'd probably be the favorite to win an election. But they've nominated a lot of people who don't have clear positions, have made lots of inflammatory statements, have essentially allowed themselves to sort of become the focus of the election rather than having the focus on Democrats. And that's, I think, hurt Republican standing a little bit. Now, we again still have a month and a half. There's still plenty of time. But for the Democrats, they've wanted to make this election not a referendum on their governance, but instead a choice between Republicans and Democrats. Because if that happens, they think they're better positioned. And I think they've been somewhat successful at doing that. Again, partially because Republicans have helped them. But again, I think all things equal, the Republican Party should be in a better shape to win. And I would not be surprised if the enthusiasm we're seeing for Democrats is a little bit of a high watermark, and we actually do see a little bit of a reversion back to the mean, with Republicans a little bit more advantaged as we're getting closer to Election Day. All right, what else do we got? What will Republican victory mean for global trade, especially EU trade? I think that depends on the level of victory. So remember, Biden is still going to be president. Republicans are not going to be able to get Biden out of the White House. And even though they're talking about maybe impeaching him, it wouldn't pass, right? Because you need 60 votes in the Senate for an impeachment to carry, and I don't really see a scenario where Republicans get 60 seats or that any number of Democrats like buck the Democratic Party to support a Republican impeachment. So Biden will be there, will be able to veto stuff. So I do think you won't see any new trade agreements, any new trade policies go through. I think the next 2 years, honestly, both on sort of international trade agreements, but also every sort of aspect of policy, will likely be one of sort of stagnation where nothing passes, nothing happens. We're likely to see a couple of debt limit, brinkmanship face-offs, or things like that about funding government, the kind of stuff we see when there's a divided government and a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. But I think fundamentally the next 2 years is going to be one of stagnation, and I think it really is an open question of like, is that stagnation okay because the economy is improving and getting healthier, or is that a stagnation going to feel bad and people are going to be really angry about it because the economy doesn't seem to be doing well? I think, I think the next couple of months and what happens with inflation, if the job market stays stable, really is going to tell us if this is going to be like the early teens under Obama when the economy was improving relatively well and there's just sort of a political circus, or is this going to be like the late 70s where people felt like the bottom was falling out the economy, and it really created a lot of heat on Ford and Carter back then. So let's see what's next. How important was the passage of the Anti-Inflation Act? Is it just a very watered down version of Biden's infrastructure bill? Well, I think it depends on what you mean by important. Politically, I don't think it's important. I don't think it's going to have an impact on the election. I think people have already kind of forgotten about it. Even when it passed, people didn't really know what it was about. So I think politically speaking, it's not going to do much. In terms of actual policy and actual like an impact on America, I think it's huge. I think it's the biggest investment on clean energy the country's ever made. I think it's the kind of thing that we're going to be seeing the ripple effects of for decades. But this is the unfortunate reality of American politics is like good policy is oftentimes not good politics. And unless you have a way to make it really clear and really visible to people, like what a policy is doing in their lives in a very immediate fashion, and you're able to get media to report on it in a way that like makes it an interesting, compelling story, it doesn't really matter in terms of your ability to win elections. So, so I think again, it depends on important. I think it is in truth a very important bill that is going to probably do a lot in American society, but I think it has very little impact on what's going to happen in the elections. Speaking of impact, what impact do you think the January 6th hearings have had? Will they have an effect going forward? So we've been doing research rather on the January 6th hearings with Reuters all summer. We'll probably do another wave of that survey after the hearing that there's maybe going to have in October. Big picture, it hasn't changed things. We still see most Republicans saying that the election was stolen from Trump, most everyone else saying that Biden actually won. But we have seen the number of Republicans who say that Trump should run again decline a little bit, and the number of Republicans saying that Biden is an illegitimate president decline a little bit. Not a lot, right? Still a majority thinks he's not. But that decline, I think, is attributable to these hearings, and I think they have had that sort of impact. And again, I think it depends on what you mean by important. I think politically, I don't think they're going to do a lot. I think depending on what they talk about in October, they may help Democrats in that it'll be another news cycle or three where people aren't talking about the economy. Instead, they're talking about Trump, and Democrats not having people talk about the economy is good for them, considering how bad they're doing on the economy. But the issue itself isn't going to move a lot of voters. It's not going to move a lot of people. But for the historical record, I think these hearings have been very interesting and very, I think, insightful in terms of what's actually happened. So, like in terms of posterity having a better understanding of the events of this time period, I think they've been hugely useful, and they're going to be that sort of first draft of history that 20, 30, 40 years from now, people are going to draw upon heavily to try to make sense of this crazy, crazy time. Why do you say the economy's bad? Jobs are up even in manufacturing. Yes, there's a worry about inflation, but can the Dems play up the good aspects? I say the economy is bad because most Americans think the economy is bad. I'm not an economist, so you're right. I'm not actually someone who's positioned to say if the economy is good or bad. I'm sorry. I'm sort of shorthanding what the American public is saying, and the American public is saying they think it's bad, and that's primarily because of inflation, because people are having their income shrunk. Basically, they can't buy as much as they used to. Uh, and I think that's real. That's been happening. Gas prices were insane this summer. I think for Democrats, they've tried to talk up a little bit the good, like the jobs numbers, for instance. Democrats have tried to talk up the good parts of it, but I think because the prices are so widely felt, like everyone is feeling the price pressures, the economy is a net negative for Democrats because people are just so much more likely to look at the bad things that are happening than the good things. So, you're going to talk to somebody and be like, well, aren't you thankful you still have a job? They're like, yeah, that's fine. But why is everything so expensive, right? Like people are just wired to think about the bad rather than the good. So that's why I think the economy is a net negative for the Democratic Party right now, and continues to be at least as long as we're sort of in this period of sort of price pressures and inflation. But yeah, I think the economy. Again, I'm not an economist. I don't know. The economy's okay. We'll see if we have experienced a recession in Q2, Q3. I guess in a couple of weeks after the end of Q3. But like it's not like it's a severe recession because there's not been widespread layoffs or anything like that. So that's a good question or a good observation. Can Democrats turn things around in Georgia, or is this just a course correct back towards the red? Honestly, I think a toss-up in Georgia is pretty good for the Democrats. I mean, Georgia had until 2020 been seen as a very Republican state, as part of the Deep South. I do think that it's going to be very close because I think Georgia is a very divided state. Uh, you have Atlanta, and then you have sort of the Black Belt and sort of southern Georgia, versus sort of the very sort of more rural, exurban white of sort of the Atlanta exurbs and the rest of the state. I think population-wise, it's very divided right now. And I don't know to what extent Abrams, particularly, has been able to sort of recapture some of the magic that her candidacies before that some of the other candidacies had in the elections. And Raphael Warnock, even though he's popular, is running against a Georgia legend in Herschel Walker. I mean, I'm actually from the Deep South, and before Herschel Walker ran, I do remember how he was sort of venerated as a saint for, his performance as a running back for the University of Georgia in 1980, 81, 82. So, I don't think you should discount the factor of that. And honestly, most people aren't paying that close attention. So they're like, oh, Herschel Walker's running. I love that guy. He was great. He killed people in 1981, when Georgia won their national championship before this last year. So yeah, I think Georgia is just going to be a really close election. I think it's a state that's very closely divided. I don't think that Democrats are actually doing terribly bad. I think it's a hard state for Democrats to win, and they're doing pretty well. And again, looking at the broader economic or national conditions, the economy is not great. Well, okay, people don't think the economy is great. Sorry, I'm already not saying myself. People don't think the economy is great, and I think that doesn't help Warnock or Abrams. So, that Warnock's running in a tie and that Abrams is in sort of low single digits after an incumbent governor isn't bad. But it's a very closely fought state. Are you mystified by the Fetterman poll numbers? Like, is this real even after the stroke? Uh, this is, I think, one of those instances of a Republican kind of getting in their own way, because I think Dr. Oz is just not proven to be a very good candidate. But I think Fetterman is also someone who's mastered the modern political media environment, because he has basically just been trolling Dr. Oz for this entire campaign and has been very effective at turning the focus back to negative stuff that's kind of funny, that's kind of the kind of thing people chuckle about Dr. Oz, and not focusing on the things that might be a negative for himself. So, not talking about how the Pennsylvania economy is a little bit stagnant, or not talking about how he doesn't necessarily have a lot of plans that have at least broken through to the public. I think so. I actually believe these numbers that Fetterman's doing relatively well in Pennsylvania, and Fetterman honestly kind of looks like a guy from Central Casting if you're going to try to run someone in Central Pennsylvania, right? That big guy with tattoos, wears cargo shorts all the time. And Americans have historically not really cared that much about the health stuff. I mean, remember FDR, was in a wheelchair and was president like 3 times. So, I don't think the stroke necessarily is that Fetterman had is as big a detriment, but I do think that Fetterman has figured out a way to take advantage of the media, the political media ecosystem in a way that, is very actually Trump-like, right? Trump also dominated the political news cycle and was able to twist it to focus on whatever he sort of wanted to talk about that day. I think Fetterman's sort of doing that in a lesser way, right? Because he's just running for Senate rather than president. But this is very much a case of a race that has been run on Fetterman's terms very much from the start. And Oz has just not been able to get out from his own way. Do the performances of some candidates like Oz or JD Vance show that Trump's influence is more important in primaries than the general election? That's a good question. I think that's a question that we're going to see, right? Like, well, let's see how these elections play out. But I do think it does speak to sort of the contrasting incentives that Republicans specifically are facing right now, because I think it's important to remember that the beating heart of the Republican Party isn't Washington D.C. or policy making apparatuses. It's conservative media, right? Like conservative media is the center of the Republican Party, and to be successful in conservative media, you have to be someone who's really good at grabbing attention, right? Someone who's really good at sort of being kind of outrageous, because that's what media wants. Any news media, not conservative media, all news media wants people who are going to be good at grabbing attention because that's their business model. But to be a good elected official, right, or to be a good candidate for office, you want to have a little bit more of a moderate thing, not necessarily be, especially in an environment like this where theoretically, if you're just a generic Republican, you're probably in a good shape to win. You may not want to be quite so outrageous. So I think candidates like Vance, JD Vance, like Dr. L sort of started off with, but I think he sort of fizzled out. And you can sort of see the problem with someone who's not really a political celebrity, is sort of another celebrity trying to parachute in. But like Governor DeSantis in Florida, or these others who are, I think, very good at navigating the attention economy and grabbing attention, but maybe are struggling in more typical election scenarios because people don't want to vote for assholes, right? All the time. Now, sometimes they do, right? But I do think that it's a contrasting or conflicting incentive structures, particularly it happens on the Democratic side too, but it's particularly in the Republican side. That I think we're seeing sort of playing out in this election cycle. And I think the Trump acolytes are people who maximized their attention grabbiness, right? Uh, and maybe sort of minimize their just being a boring policy Mitt Romney-esque kind of guy, person. Let's see. What could the consequences of the arrival of Magas in Congress in terms of foreign policy with regard to Ukraine or Taiwan? That's a good question. It's not necessarily one I'm super well equipped to answer. I'm not really a foreign policy expert, but we do have some of them already in Congress, right? Like Marjorie Taylor Greene, very MAGA-y. There's several other members of Congress. I do think we'd probably see a more of an isolationist foreign policy. That seems to be sort of the semi-consistent sort of point of view that they have, is that we shouldn't be bothering with people in other countries too much. But I think it's also not 100% a consistent policy set. And I think the big thing about MAGA is whatever sort of Trump feels that day. So it'd sort of be very impulse driven and might sort of bounce around a little bit depending on sort of whatever Trump's talking about at any given point in time. But again, that's sort of speculation a little bit. I don't have a clear point of view, not being a foreign policy expert. All right, so I think we're out of time today. It's at, yeah, we're right at the top of the hour. So thank you again for joining. Appreciate your time today. All of this is publicly available data. It's available on our website. You're certainly welcome to share or use any of these. As I mentioned before, the next webinar will be October 25th. That will be our last pre-election webinar, and the election will be about a week and a half after that. So please do join us for that. Until then, be well. Let me know if you need anything, certainly at your disposal, and thank you for joining us today. Take care.